Hi, everyone. I'm Maureen Ritchie, and I will be moderating the second session for today. This session will be structured similarly as the last session, in that we're going to start out with a long talk by Lili Sahakyan, who's from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. And her talk will be followed by a discussant and then a Q&A period. So I think we can go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Sahakyan.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, or should I say good evening for some of you, or maybe even good morning, depending on where you are watching this from. I'm truly delighted to be part of this event. And I guess the silver lining of this pandemic is that it has made conferences a lot more accessible, and many more of our colleagues can join us, which is great. And even family members who have never seen us present have an opportunity to see us present now remotely. I want to thank the organizing committee for putting together this fantastic event. It was much needed to have a scientific exchange and take a mind off of the events that are going on in the world. So thank you so much for putting this together. I am absolutely excited to present a new line of work from our lab. And it represents the senior author on this paper is a graduate student in my lab, Jonathan Whitlock. It started as Jonathan's first year project and gradually evolved into his master's thesis and ignited his desire to continue doing eye tracking research. So we recently published this paper. It just came out and it's available from our website if you're interested. So we are going to use eye movement analysis and try and understand directed forgetting, and also contrast it with other strong and weak memories using this tool that we have discovered. So we do a lot of directed forgetting research, and I just want to mention that it's not always the case that remembering is the good outcome of memory and forgetting is the flaw of our system, a nuisance, something we wish we could avoid. There are many cases when remembering wrong, outdated, or just plain wrong information or traumatic information is not the desired outcome of memory, and forgetting it would be much more beneficial and serve an adaptive function. So there are many cases when forgetting is the good thing and remembering is not necessarily the good outcome. So plenty of research has firmly established that we can downregulate unwanted memories and exert control over our memories. So we use different techniques in the laboratory to study this phenomenon. I'm going to focus on directed forgetting methods, which I will very briefly review because we're going to show you studies with this. So in item method version, you are presenting participants with single items, and each item is followed by a forget or remember cue. They are told if you get a forget cue, you will not be tested on that item, try and forget it. In the list version, you study an entire list of items before that entire list is cued with a forget or remember instruction. And at the time of test, we basically cancel the forget cue. We ask participants to either retrieve anything they can remember, including the forget items, or if we give them recognition tests, we ask them to endorse any item regardless of whether it was followed by forget or remember cue. Plenty of research has established this basic behavioral outcome that if you look at proportion correct or accuracy in memory, forget items show impaired memory compared to remember condition, and this is called the directed forgetting effect. And there are many ideas about what produces this effect. So I'll talk about those mechanisms when I present the studies. But one thing I want to draw attention is that majority of research, at least behavioral research on directed forgetting, has focused on percent correct or on accuracy. And typically having high accuracy is a good thing in a memory experiment, right? You want better memory, so you want higher accuracy. But we should not really ignore the task goals. So if you think about accuracy through the prism of intentional forgetting, it becomes clear that if a forget item survived in memory despite being told to forget, high accuracy really indicates unsuccessful directed forgetting, whereas low accuracy would indicate presumably more compliance with the forget condition. So I would argue that what we have studied by focusing on accuracy is really unsuccessful directed forgetting. So if you look at this iceberg, what we've really studied is items that are at the top of this surface, basically things that survive in memory despite being told to forget. But what we should have been studying is successful directed forgetting, which is items that are forgotten consistent with the instruction to forget. So this portion, this giant portion that is below the surface of the sea. Now, this is easier said than done, and accuracy is not going to be your friend here. So you really need a new measure, a concurrent measure that accompanies behavior that can be disentangled from accuracy. And our measure that is going to be concurrently accompanying accuracy is going to be eye tracking studies. So we'll present 4 experiments using eye tracking paradigm that we've discovered. In fact, it was invented. I'd like to introduce the paradigm. The paradigm was invented at University of Illinois in Neil Cohen's lab by Debbie Hannula and her colleagues way before I arrived there. And in fact, our paths never crossed at Illinois. So briefly, the paradigm involves studying arbitrary scene and face pairings. And after a series of these trials, you get the test trial. The test trial involves seeing one of the previously studied scenes along with 3 previously studied faces, but one of these faces, which is on the top left, was actually paired with that scene here, whereas these 2 other faces are familiar because you've studied them, but with different scenes. So all presented stimuli during the test trials are familiar. And during the test, we monitor eye movements. And what Hannula and colleagues have repeatedly shown was that the eyes are disproportionately drawn towards the target, the matching face that was paired with that scene. And what I'm showing you here is the viewing time course. On a vertical axis, you are seeing proportion of viewing time that was devoted towards this selected face, and that is the correct choice. And this is shown by the solid blue line. And the dashed blue line over here represents the trial if you make a mistake. Basically, if you end up selecting a lure, you see that the eye movements really distinguish correct and incorrect trials. And this behavior, viewing behavior, rises very quickly. You'll see that this is 250 millisecond time bins from the moment that this test display comes on a screen. And viewing reaches its peak around 1 second and then tapers down. So basically, what this paradigm demonstrates is that eye movements can be a sensitive marker of memory. And I say memory because in both cases here, when you select the target or if you select the lure, selection process is controlled. So the only reason you would be looking more at the target is not because of selection. So it's not like the eyes are drawn towards what you're selecting, but because you have memory for that target. Anamnesics don't show this effect. So we are going to basically borrow this paradigm and bring it to item method directed forgetting study because we were curious how directed forgetting is reflected in eye movements. And most importantly, we wanted to see if viewing will allow us to differentiate successful directed forgetting and involuntary forgetting. I'll explain this as we go along. So the design is very similar. You study scene, and instead of faces, we chose to show objects because we needed many trials, and after 108 faces, memory was at chance, so we switched to objects. So you study 54 trials that are forget trials, intermixed with 54 remember trials, and then the test block is similar to what I showed. You have an unobstructed view of the scene for 2 seconds, and then you get the 3-item test display. Now, one of these items, the apple, was paired with that scene, so it's the target. The other ones are lures. Importantly, we deliberately controlled the item strength within the test display. What I mean by that is if the apple was followed by forget cue, then so were butterfly and so were the corn. So all of them come from the same cue condition, thereby controlling the item strength. And at the time of test block, we're monitoring eye movements. So we replicated the basic directed forgetting effect in accuracy, but as I said, we're not interested in accuracy, we're interested in eye movements. So the first set of eye movement analysis will be on preferential viewing analysis, which is defined as out of total proportion of time that you view these 3 test objects. So T stands for target, L stands for lure. What percentage of time you viewed the target versus selected lure? I'm going to show you first the remember condition. And unlike Debbie's stimulus locked figure, I'm presenting the response locked figure. So that means that on every trial, we are shifting the viewing to be aligned with when the response was made. And we have 500 millisecond time bins. So basically, that amounts to a total of 2 seconds that took place before the response was made, and a response was made right here. So what you see is a replication of basic preferential viewing effect in a remember condition, such that you're viewing the selected target a lot more than the selected lure. And you can see that viewing continues to rise, and it reaches its peak around 500 milliseconds prior to the response, and then it tapers down. So this is sort of the critical time window when it reaches its peak. And the question is, how does this differ from directed forgetting? Now, I'm going to show you what I call unsuccessful directed forgetting. So you were told to forget that target, but you didn't. You nevertheless selected it. And you will see that unsuccessful directed forgetting looks very much like successful remembering does. Now, interestingly, successful directed forgetting, which is presented here by this dashed red line, looks quite different from what I would call involuntary forgetting, which is this dashed green line. So let me unpack that. The dashed green line represents conditions when you select the lure in a remember condition. So you were told to remember the target, you didn't, you forgot it, you selected the lure. You will see that you're viewing that lure a lot less in a remember condition than you do in a forget condition. So this is the first demonstration that eye movements might distinguish successful directed forgetting in dashed red line from involuntary forgetting shown in this dashed green line. The second analysis is going to examine those incorrect trials when a lure is selected. So let's look first at forget condition. So you're told to forget the target, looks like you did because you selected this lure, and I call this successful directed forgetting. The question is, how much did you view that target on that trial despite selecting this lure? If you have no memory of the target, then viewing to this target and this other lure that you didn't select should be equivalent. On the other hand, if there is some retained memory for this target, you should be viewing this target more compared to this other unselected lure. And the question is, does that differ between successful directed forgetting and involuntary directed forgetting? And that would be an important signature to distinguish these two forms of forgetting. So again, these are incorrect trials. Viewing towards unselected target, shown here in a solid green line, is substantially above the other lure. So this suggests that there is some retained memory of the target. Even though you are selecting this lure, you're nevertheless viewing this target a lot more than this one. Now, in a forget condition, on the other hand, it appears that you have less memory of this target compared to the remember condition. So that memory for that target appears to be suppressed or at least downregulated. So this is the second analysis that suggests that there is a difference between successful directed forgetting and involuntary forgetting. Now, of course, we wondered whether these findings would generalize to any strong and weak memories or whether they are specific to directed forgetting. So you can think of forget items are the weak items, remember items are the strong items. Are these findings specific to DF, or will we see the same thing if we examine strong and weak memories? Surprisingly, we didn't find any answer to this question in the literature, so Jonathan decided to do his own experiment. And in this study, there is no directed forgetting manipulation. It's objective repetitions of once versus twice presented pairs. So in a preview phase, subjects studied 54 of these pairs of scene and object pairings, and then right away went on to study 108 pairs, where 54 were from this preview phase and 54 were new. So basically, we have twice versus once presented items. Test phase is identical, and note there is no directed forgetting effect. No directed forgetting manipulation here.
This is your 5-minute warning.
Thank you. So accuracy was naturally higher in the twice than once presented condition. Now, what happens to viewing in twice presented condition? So strong condition shows the canonical preferential viewing effect that we have replicated before. But the surprise comes when we look at weak condition, once presented condition. This is where the two solid lines start to diverge, especially in this critical time window. And the dashed lines do not differ from each other. So just to remind you, this is the opposite of what we saw in directed forgetting, where the two solid lines were on top of each other and the difference was in the dashed lines here. Now here, we're seeing evidence that strength-based viewing may produce different signature than directed forgetting. And we find the same also in the retained traces analysis. So this is looking at a target on those incorrect trials. You'll remember in directed forgetting, we found that there was less retention of the target in the weak condition of experiment, in a forget condition basically. But we do not see that in here, where there appears to be equivalent amount of retention. Now, I will not go into details of experiment 3, in part because there is really no manipulation in this study. They study 108 pairs, and at the time they make the response, they have to indicate their confidence, low, medium, or high confidence. The reason I wanted to show portion of this study is at least because we have this nice graded pattern of, subjective memory strength, low, medium, and high strength. And we see exactly the same gradedness also in preferential viewing, such that strong memories receive more viewing compared to medium, compared to low. So this is, again, opposite of what we saw in directed forgetting, but this is consistent with previous experiment where we had objective repetitions. And again, no difference in the lure, selected lures. So finally, I showed you one study on item method directed forgetting, 2 studies where there was no directed forgetting. So we want to go back and see if we can generalize directed forgetting findings to list method directed forgetting. And this is specifically interesting because list method usually does not emerge in recognition. So we're not expecting accuracy differences, but maybe we will see something interesting in eye movements. And indeed we did. So the design is very similar. 54 pairs were assigned to the first list. After subjects studied 54 pairs, Jonathan created this creative gibberish that basically pops up on the screen, making participants think that we had a computer crash. Nothing here makes sense, really. So if you're a coder, you probably will immediately recognize that this is human-made. But participants believed that we had a computer crash, and they were told, forget the first list, you will not be tested, and then the second list is your real list. So here is the beautiful null effect in recognition memory, in associative recognition especially. This is not novel. Now, in the remember condition, again, we are replicating the canonical preferential viewing effect, more viewing devoted towards the target than towards the lure. We're also replicating what we saw in item method in the sense that if forgetting is unsuccessful, you are not really any different than successful remembering. On the other hand, you're viewing this selected lure more compared to the remember condition. So this aspect, again, replicates experiment 1 findings in list method paradigm. Where it doesn't replicate, and this is an important divergence, is the retained traces analysis. If you recall, in the first experiment, we found the difference between the solid green and solid red, which represents potentially suppressed memory for the forget item in the item method version, but we do not see that in list method. We just see equivalent amount of retention of traces of forgotten items.
1 minute.
Basically, directed forgetting produces different viewing patterns from other strength-based manipulations in memory. When it is unsuccessful, it looks much like successful remembering. When it is successful, it leads to more viewing of the selected lure. In contrast, strengthening manipulations produce the opposite pattern if they do not have any directed forgetting goal. So weaker conditions are associated with diminished viewing of selected target. On incorrect trials, we found that more viewing was directed towards that unselected target than unselected lure. So this suggests that there is some retained implicit memory of the target. But importantly, in successful directed forgetting, especially in item method, we saw that there is impaired memory of those unselected targets compared to involuntary forgetting. And this is important because eye movements became a new tool to differentiate these 2 forms of forgetting. In contrast, in experiments where there was no directed forgetting, there was equivalent amount of retention of that target memory trace between strong and weak conditions. Finally, directed forgetting methods share similarities, but they also have important differences. So the similarity here was that in both methods, we saw that there was enhanced viewing that was directed towards the selected lure in a forget condition compared to remember. And it appears that behavioral accuracy did not play a role in this finding, because in the first experiment we had robust item method directed forgetting in recognition. In the last experiment, we didn't have any accuracy differences. The difference between the two methods is that when successful, item method directed forgetting impaired memory of targets, whereas list method directed forgetting did not show this impairment. So I think that overall, the results of eye movement analysis are consistent with the inhibitory account, and they are not consistent with the passive terminating rehearsal account, which has been proposed for many years. But inhibitory account has become quite popular, especially in the neural literature, and I think eye movement analysis are consistent with those findings as well. Now, the list method directed forgetting finding, I put the box around the context shift account, but I want to make it clear that we didn't predict those findings based on context shift account. It's just that they are inconsistent with inhibitory account, inconsistent with terminating rehearsal account, and so far we have only 3 accounts, so by default it goes, I put the box around the context shift account. Finally, I just want to leave you on a note that I hope I've convinced you that you can use eye tracking, especially for cognitive psychologists who are not trained to do, EEG and imaging research. Eye tracking can be relatively inexpensive. It does not require complex mapping between responses and behavior, and is a very sensitive marker of memory, and it makes this important progress on theories of accounts where accuracy alone may be insensitive.
Wow, great. That was such a great talk. It was really fascinating. I love the idea of the...
Did I stop screen sharing?
Yeah, so if our behind the scenes gurus can take care of that. Great. So up next, we're going to have a discussant join us. So I'm pleased to welcome Dr. Dave Warren, coming from the University of Nebraska, to join us to reflect on Dr. Sahakyan's work today.
Terrific. Thank you very much. Let me start my stopwatch here and share my screen. Okay, how's that?
Perfect.
Terrific. So yes, terrific talk by Lili, and it's a lovely paper too. If anybody has an opportunity to peruse it, it's a nice demonstration of their explanation of their empirical findings, and a lovely piece of scholarship as well. So what I'd like to do is offer just a few thoughts on potential discussion topics. So I actually was at University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign when Jen Ryan and Debbie Handale were working on this paradigm. And so one of the things that I thought was the work that was presented just before did a terrific job of looking at response-locked changes in eye movements due to different histories of directed forgetting or not. And I thought one of the and in particular at this encoding time manipulation of orientation toward or away from to promote or degrade memory for these items. One of the things from the earlier work that I wanted to highlight that might be interesting in terms of a retrieval time orientation was a finding that Debbie Handale and Jen Ryan reported with Neil Cohen. Slightly different paradigm, but same general idea. 3 faces on screen, each with a different viewing history. In this case, the particular version that I'm thinking of, one of the faces in this 3-face display had been previously seen by the participants. And what varied then was first the viewing history of the faces, but then the instructional orientation given to participants when they were shown this 3-face display. And the orientations, again, administered at retrieval time were either to look toward the familiar face, which we can see picked out here on the top in the look condition. So we can see that, again, these time courses of viewing, just like Lili was showing us, we see increased viewing to the familiar face. And in this case, this can be contrasted with a different, this can be contrasted with the don't look orientation at the bottom, where participants were oriented to not look at the familiar faces. And we see differences in the time course according to this retrieval time manipulation of orientation. Again, this is memory dependent. One of these faces is familiar, the others are not. And it's interesting to watch the resolution of that familiarity over time. If you look at the first maybe 1,500 or 2,000 milliseconds of viewing, we can see that there is a difference in the time course associated with that. And this is a very different trajectory long term for these look and don't look conditions. So again, this is an example of a retrieval time orientation that changes these patterns of eye movements. I also wanted to talk a little bit about some brain activity measures related to subsequent forgetting, whether it's incidental or intentional, as in the directed forgetting paradigms that Lili was talking about. So there are subsequent forgetting effects that have been reported out in fMRI studies. This is about a 10-year-old meta-analysis by Kim showing off subsequent forgetting effects that tended, oh goodness. What did I do? Okay, I guess hopefully we're past the error messages now. So this meta-analysis of subsequent forgetting effects suggests that there's concentrated activity in the lateral parietal cortex and maybe the lateral prefrontal cortex associated with subsequent forgetting incidentally. This can be contrasted with a more recent study looking at directed forgetting in the brain, and these are contrasts left and right of incidental forgetting on the left, incidental forgetting on the right, and intentional forgetting on the left. You can see that there are different neural loci associated with intentional forgetting and unintentional forgetting. In a review by Anderson and Helsmeyer, we see the same finding recapitulated in panel A. There have also been simultaneous fMRI and EEG studies looking at the neural activity associated with an intentional forgetting instruction. Again, we see a concentration here in left DLPFC, and they saw changes in long-range alpha-beta synchronization as well. There's actually a negative correlation between that cold response in DLPFC and those long-range alpha-beta synchronizations on EEG. And finally, the same review highlighted a repetitive TMS study which administered 1 Hertz rTMS to that DLPFC target, which actually had, so this is prior to a list-based directed forgetting paradigm. And we can see that this rTMS administration actually had the effect of enhancing forgetting versus control simulation without affecting enhancement. So this kind of stimulation applied to a brain locus associated with the directed forgetting orientation suggests that this may be a causal mechanism. And that kind of put me in mind that what I'll describe next is different. This is, of course, work out of Mike Kahana's lab from a couple of years ago. The first example, I think, of closed loop simulation benefiting memory. So this is closed loop simulation with the aim of improving or enhancing memory item by item. Results like what we saw Lili talk about and what I just talked about with rTMS applied at a block level makes me think about the possibility of potentially, with enough items and enough subjects, exploring closed loop stimulation that might yield outcomes related to these kinds of directed forgetting paradigms. Can you enhance somebody's ability to forget something in the same way that you can enhance somebody's ability to remember something? So I just had a handful of questions. I'll run through these quickly because I do want to make sure the audience gets to ask their questions as well. Thinking about this, I was wondering how the processes and mechanisms related to item-based and list-based directed forgetting differ. I wondered whether shared mechanisms are utilized for directed forgetting related inhibition of memory at encoding and at retrieval, potentially. I wondered whether directed forgetting of complex relational memories actually affords multiple opportunities for directed forgetting strategies. That is, could different mechanisms be brought to bear on the problem of directed forgetting if you have a relational hippocampal dependent memory? Could you forget the items? Could you forget the relations? Could you forget both? And then finally, to the extent that directed forgetting relies on active inhibition, what are the implications of changes related to development, ages, and disease of the brain systems that provide this active inhibition? So with that, I will stop, and I would love to hear some of the audience's questions.
Wow, thank you for a really lovely discussion. Before we get to audience questions, I do want to give Lili a chance to respond to any of the questions that Dave just raised or anything else that he touched on in his presentation.
Thank you so much, Dave, for drawing on those diverse body of literature and connecting all these pieces together. It was absolutely great. I totally understand that within the domain of cognitive psychology, people may not necessarily be reading the neural literature as much, or may not necessarily have the expertise to interpret what they are reading. So in some ways, I was happy to bring eye movement paradigm to make it accessible to cognitive psychology, because ultimately I think some of the disconnect between the mechanism, is it inhibitory, is it not inhibitory, is it in list method, or is it an item method? Some of the disconnect comes from the methods that we use, and I think accuracy we've made great progress studying this phenomena with accuracy, but I think it's not as sensitive as some of these other measures are. And I think my previous thinking has been that item method directed forgetting does not involve any inhibition. It's just selective rehearsal, which used to be a popular account. It still is a very popular account, especially in cognitive psychology. But with the invention of this eye movement paradigm, I think I've changed my view, because the data seems to be more consistent with the inhibitory, at least in the item method. It does not, so far, based on one study, we didn't find any evidence in list method, but I think the paradigm is so rich that it allows you to study different aspects, just like you mentioned, Dave. Do people forget the relationship? Do they forget the item? And Jonathan Whitlock, my student, has made great progress already answering some of these questions. Behaviorally, we have paper under review, but I think this paradigm affords us opportunity to study those questions with eye tracking, and maybe one day integrate it with MRI, because I know the paradigm is well integrated already with MRI, so it expands our repertoire of skills.
Great.
Okay, so I think we'll turn it over to some questions from the audience. Why don't we see if y'all can bear with a little bit of technicals. We'll invite Miriam up on stage, and she can ask her question in person if she would like to. Oh, I already just saw the note that said no need to bring me on stage, so forget that. I'm going to read it out loud. So neat findings. Did you collect eye tracking during encoding? I wonder if eye movements on encoding could help you predict a tendency toward preferential viewing for forgotten items that were directed to be forgotten. Those forgotten items might reflect a mixture of ones that participants might have forgotten naturally, and those that were encoded fairly strongly, but then tagged to be forgotten. Maybe encoding eye movements can help tell the difference between those.
That's an excellent question. We did not do encoding at this, because as I said, this was the first series of studies. We are collecting encoding-based data in our new studies that we're currently writing up. So we are indeed trying to link encoding-based differences through pupillometry measures to preferential viewing measures at the time of test. And we have some interesting findings that especially as it relates to cross-race effect, which we're currently investigating with this paradigm. But as far as relating it to directed forgetting, I do not have data on it yet, but that's definitely something that now that we know how encoding pupil size differences relate to preferential viewing, that would be a natural next step to repeat the study. And maybe one day when we're allowed to do actual in-person research, we'll go back to our eye tracker.
So other questions are welcome, because I think we do still have a minute or two, but I'll go ahead and ask one question that I had, which is, how do you distinguish evidence for implicit memory for the items that they were told to forget from them complying with the experimenter's demands? So if they can remember that they were supposed to forget it, and they actually can remember it, but then they know that they're not supposed to, do you think that that influences their behavior?
Well, in this paradigm, we've done series of studies with different, Ipe Lo, my other graduate student, has looked at manipulations where we actually honor versus dishonor the forget instruction. And you can create massive differences in directed forgetting. If you start honoring the forget cue, people people become very good at withholding those items, but I think they are withholding it because they end up remembering it. In this particular case, so this is dishonor version, basically. We tell them to forget, but at the time of test, we cancel the instruction. So, there is a lot of research, at least in the behavioral research, that demonstrates that demand characteristics do not necessarily play a role in this case. Like if you pay people more to give you more items, it doesn't improve their performance. So Colin McLeod has done a series of studies on that. So we were less concerned that people were actively just following our instructions in this case, but I do know that you can move the effect around using honor-dishonor manipulation, and we are currently looking at it in a lab.
Cool. All right, thank you so much. I think I will always interpret errors that come up during the rest of the crowdcast as just some sort of manipulation that we're all trying to remember or forget things differently. So thank you to our speakers, Lili Sahakyan and Dave Warren.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So we are going to turn it over to the next talk. This will be a short talk. So we can go ahead and invite Qihong Lu onto the stage. Qihong is coming from Princeton University, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks. Can I share my screen now?
Yeah, so if you mouse over your own.
Oh, I see. Got it. Sorry. Okay. Is it showing properly? Yeah, okay.
Yep. Good.
Okay, thanks everyone. I'm Q. Today I want to talk about a neural network model that learns to use episodic memory for event prediction. This work is advised by Ken Norman and Reconsidering. Many existing computational models of episodic memory are designed to capture human behavior in well-controlled scenario, and sometimes it's hard to generalize these insights to natural settings. For example, say you are watching a two-part movie. To process these two event sequences, the agent needs to decide when to recall episodic memory about part one in order to properly understand part two. Whereas in many classic experiments, participants don't need to decide when to recall, they just need to recall when they get probed. To understand how to optimally deploy episodic memory during event processing, we built a neural network model that learns to recall episodic memory to predict upcoming events. And today we will look at how the learned policy learned by the model handles this problem. Here's the model. It has two parts. The cortex is a recurrent neural network with working memory, and it predicts upcoming events. The model also has an episodic module that stores episodic memory. And to encode a new episodic memory, it simply copy the current hidden state and append it to the list. At recall, the level of activation of each memory is proportional to its similarity with the current hidden state. Then I take a similarity-weighted sum over all memory and add it back to the cortex. And critically, the model learns to control a gate on episodic recall, and the gate influences the level of activation for all memories, which in turn control when to recall. And the model learns this recall policy with reinforcement learning. Namely, the model gets rewarded or penalized depending on whether its prediction about the upcoming event is correct. It can also say it doesn't know what the upcoming event is, in which case it gets 0 reward. To sum up, it's up to the model to decide what to do with episodic memory. We as the experimenter don't specify that. The model's direct goal is to maximize the expected cumulative reward. And when we train the model, it figures out a policy for setting the hippocampal gate that maximizes the reward it gets. Let me introduce the test design we used, which meant to capture the following experiment by Janice Chen and many others. In this experiment, participants viewed a movie in the scanner, And in the recent memory condition, or RM condition, people view the movie continuously. In the distant memory, or DM condition, there's a 1-day delay between the two parts, so they had to recall episodic memory from part 1 to understand part 2. In the no memory condition, participants viewed part 2 without viewing part 1. If we concentrate on the first few minutes of part 2, in the recent memory condition, people formed a situation model during part 1, which is still maintained during part 2 to help them to understand the ongoing situation. In the distant memory condition, because there's a 1-day delay, the situation model is no longer active in working memory during part 2, so there's a gap in their understanding of the ongoing situation. Therefore, they had to use episodic memory to fill in this gap. To summarize, there's a stronger demand for episodic memory in the distant memory condition. To simulate this task, we led the model to view a distractor event sequence, followed by 2 related event sequences that correspond to the 2-part movie. The last 2 sequences are related in the sense that knowing everything about part 1 makes everything during part 2 predictable. And in the distant memory condition, we simply flush the working memory of the model by resetting the hidden state of the cortical network. So the model had to recall the correct episodic memory encoded during movie part 1. And in the no memory condition, the model has no relevant episodic memory or working memory, as it never get to see movie part 1. In the experiment by Chen et al., they measured hippocampal cortical correlation as a neural signature of recall, and they found that the level of hippocampal cortical correlation is much stronger during the first few minutes of part 2 in the distant memory condition compared to the recent memory condition. And the puzzle here is that participants in both conditions have the same set of episodic memory, but only participants in the distant memory condition showed strong signature of recall. We found the same thing in the model. Here I'm plotting the activation of different memories separated by target and lure over time during part 2. And we can see that in the distant memory condition, the model recalled episodic memory at the beginning of part 2, and the model in the recent memory condition, on the other hand, didn't recall nearly as much. Why is this the case? Again, models in both conditions have access to the same set of episodic memories. The answer is that since model in the distant memory condition has a gap in their understanding of the ongoing situation, they had to recall episodic memory. In contrast, model in the recent memory condition had very little uncertainty about the upcoming event, so recall wouldn't provide additional information. In fact, it might hurt the model since it might recall an irrelevant memory. And because of this, the model learned a policy to not recall if it thinks they already know the answer. When there's a gap in the model's understanding, the model needs to recall episodic memory, but more specifically, it needs to decide when to recall. In general, recall early means that the model had fewer observations, so it has a higher risk of recalling a relevant memory. On the other hand, if the model delays recall, the risk is lower, but the expected information gain of retrieving episodic memory is also lower. To test the model, to test if the model can respond properly, we manipulated the risk by varying the level of penalty for mispredicting the upcoming event. And indeed, the model can balance this speed accuracy trade-off of recall, again plotting memory activation over time during part 2. As you can see, the model recalls earlier if the penalty for mispredicting the upcoming event is low. Conversely, the model learned, in other words, the model learned a policy such that it waits longer to recall if the penalty is high. And this is because waiting for more observations can enhance the chance of recalling the right memory. Many recent studies, by Professor Duncan and many others, have shown that encountering a familiar stimulus shifts the hippocampus into a retrieval mode where it is more likely to recall stored episodic memories. We can use our model to understand why is this the case. Intuitively, seeing a novel stimulus indicates that there is no relevant episodic memory, and conversely, seeing a familiar stimulus indicates that there is a relevant episodic memory. And in general, a signal that covaries with the presence of a relevant episodic memory informs whether you should recall. And to test the model, to test if the model can learn to exploit this familiarity signal to modulate its recall policy, during training, we provided a signal that indicates if the model has a relevant episodic memory or not. And let's call this the ground truth familiarity signal. We found that the model trained with such signal recalls earlier in the distant memory condition because there is a familiar stimulus, and that gives the model the confidence that there is a relevant memory to recall. On the other hand, in the no memory condition, the signal shows that the stimulus is novel, which indicates there is no relevant episodic memory, so the model suppressed recall even further. Today, I focused on recall policy. I showed that the model learned to use episodic memory to predict upcoming events. The recall policy is sensitive to uncertainty and penalty. And we also simulated the finding that the familiar stimulus can shift the hippocampus into a retrieval mode. I don't have time to cover this, but we also explore encoding policy, where we found that model that selectively encode episodic memory at event boundary performed better at event prediction later on. And this provides a rational account of recent human fMRI data showing encoding seems to take place at event boundaries. Besides, when there is schematic regularity in the environment, the model learns to exploit it, but as a byproduct, it also makes schema-consistent mistakes. We also simulated patient data by lesioning the hippocampal module of the model, and consistent with recent human fMRI data, we found the cortical network alone can integrate information over a long time scale. And finally, the model can integrate information over many partial event sequences to form a more complete situation model. Currently, we're using MVPA methods to track the internal state of the model over time, treating the network activity as neuroimaging data. And we found that we can precisely track when and what information get transferred from hippocampus to cortex. This will help us to make time series prediction of how episodic memory is deployed when human process naturalistic events for empirical works. And thanks for your attention. I especially want to thank my advisor, Ken Norman and Ri Hassan, and my lab mates. I also want to thank the committee for the opportunity to present our work. And thanks, and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you so much for a really nice talk. So we are going to try to invite one of the first question askers on screen, if that ends up being possible.
Yeah, sounds great.
Mix it up a little bit, get some new faces up here. Yep. I think that's one of the things that we all miss the most about being online instead of in person, is being able to see everyone face to face.
Yeah, it's great.
Okay, so he's been invited, so hopefully we'll see his face in a moment. Okay, so actually we're going to go ahead. We will just go ahead and ask the questions. In the future, if you're asking a question, you can comment whether you're interested in coming on stage or whether you're not interested in coming on stage. But the first question comes from Mark Howard. And the question is, are the hidden states autocorrelated in time? And if so, why?
Right. So there are two reasons. Right. So first of all, it is autocorrelated, and there are two reasons. One reason is that because the hidden state is maintained by a recurrent neural network, so the current hidden state depends on the previous input and also the hidden state at the previous time step. So that's one reason why it's strongly correlated. Another reason is that the events are over time, or the inputs of the recurrent neural networks are correlated over time, and that depends on the schematic structure of the world, which generated the input. Thanks for the question.
Mhm. And then we have another highly voted question here, which is what kind of information from part 1 of the movie does the model use to predict what will happen in part 2? Presumably humans need to process very abstract or high-level information from part 1 in order to build a situation model for part 2. Is the model using some sort of perceptual information?
Yeah, that's a great question too. Because I didn't explain the stimuli in detail. So the event sequences we used for the input for the model were generated from a directed graph where each node represents an event and each transition represents a transition across events, and they carry probability. And at every time step, the model actually gets to observe some feature of the event. For example, one feature can be the weather. And over many trials, the model can learn that this feature might control some of the transition in the graph. So once the model observes, let's say the weather is rainy, maybe the model will predict that the main character will carry an umbrella before going outside. So that's these information, or what we call event features, are what's being reinstated during part 2 to predict how the event unfolds during part 2. Thanks for the question.
Oh, and I think I didn't mention that was from Olga Litsitsky.
Thanks. Thanks, Olga.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for a great talk. And I think we'll go ahead and get ready for the next one. Thanks again, Q.
Thanks.
So the next talk is going to be from Kevin Himberger, who is coming from Johns Hopkins University.
Okay.
Hi, Kevin.
Hey. Let me share my screen. All right. Okay, well, thank you to the organizers for putting together another great CEMS and allowing us to present our work. Today I'm going to be talking about how we learn sequential regularities in our world. And previous research on this topic has suggested that we can learn these regularities through mere exposure via implicit and automatic processes. And to preview our findings, we're going to suggest that the learning process itself, at least in adults, is influenced by attention, which calls into question some of these beliefs about automaticity. So today I'm going to talk about what is statistical learning, for those of you who aren't familiar, and how it uniquely fits into the learning taxonomy. And then finally, we'll talk about this question about if statistical learning is automatic. And so to start off, let's do a bit of an example. We're going to do doodle time. And so this is a replication of an earlier study by Jenny Safran and colleagues. And what we're going to do is we're going to study the effects of auditory stimuli on creativity. So I'm going to play you a sound via my phone because audio doesn't work. And I'd like you to doodle on your leg or on a desk or on a chair. You can doodle whatever you want. And then we're going to do this for about 15 seconds. Okay? Interactivity. Here we go. All right, now we're going to do a surprise familiarity test. And you're going to be asked to choose between two sets of sounds, and you're going to use the chat bar to type in your choice. So I've got these two icons, one on the left, one on the right, and you're going to type either left or right depending upon which group of sounds feels more familiar to you. Okay? I'm going to play these sounds again on my phone. So now I'm going to do the left icon. And now I'm going to do the right icon. And I'm trying to monitor the chat. There we go. All right, I'm seeing some things coming through now. And it seems that it is an overwhelming left. So let's see why that felt more familiar to you. So embedded in that stream of syllables that you heard, there were groups of 3. We call them triplets. And then these triplets were repeated pseudo-randomly one after the other. And that's what was presented. But in between each syllable was the same timing. So you couldn't tell where one triplet ended and where the next one began. You had to learn that regularity through some learning process. And this is tested, as you saw, with the 2AFC, a 2 alternative forced choice task. On one option would be a real triplet that you heard, and then the other option would be a FOIL created by taking syllables from 3 different triplets. And this type of task has been used not only in auditory paradigms, but also tactile and in vision. And vision is what we're going to be discussing today. So in our paradigm, we took the stimuli that Anna Shapiro, Nick Turk-Brown came up with. They're these colorful, abstract images, and then we presented them to participants in a stream that I'm about to show you. The other difference we have in ours, beyond just using these images, is instead of the doodle task, we asked participants to monitor the images for movement. So when they jiggled from side to side, the participant was required to press or asked to press a button. And so you can see that they just saw a stream of images, and every now and then one of the images sort of jiggled from side to side. And there was a little jiggle with that brown S. So what is statistical learning? Let's do a more formal definition. It's this automatic unconscious extraction of regularities from our environment without intent or awareness. And how is it special? Well, I want to focus on this aspect of the definition, without intent. There's this thought that it's automatic, it doesn't require effort to learn the regularities. And this is something, and I used Nick here because he was one of the first to look at visual statistical learning and also recognize the importance of selective attention in visual statistical learning, and also to use a cover task to keep it sort of unintentional. And this viewpoint on statistical learning, I put a review paper by Dick Aslan here talking about it's this mere exposure aspect where there's no feedback required for the learning. So why does this matter? Well, researchers believe that this statistical learning process underlies segmentation of continuous information. It allows us to predict upcoming events and even shapes how we perceive the world. And when statistical learning first started, or this field sort of really got going, was in the mid-90s. This was around the same time that this taxonomy came out from Squire and Zola, segmenting sort of long-term memory into implicit and explicit. And so you could say, like, well, where does statistical learning fit? And you could say maybe it fits on the right because it's thought to be implicit. You can't really verbalize what you learn, but you sort of have this feeling. Alternatively, this is around the same time that complementary learning systems happened. This idea that cortical learning was slow, but hippocampal learning was rapid. And this is rapid learning. So maybe statistical learning fit on the other side. Maybe it's something over here. And I would point you again to Anna's work and Nick's work around brain regions involved in statistical learning. But that's why it was sort of seen as a unique learning process. And in general, people have used many different paradigms. They use many different cover tasks to expose participants to regularities. So you saw the doodle task that we did in the beginning. You saw this sort of jiggle task, attention to stimulus motion. But sometimes participants are asked to attend to the triplets, to sort of know ahead of time there were going to be these triplets. Or maybe they just have passive exposure. They're just asked to attend to the stimuli. Perhaps they do a one-back task to compare 2 images one after the other, or attend to image category, or many other types of cover tasks. And you can imagine you could align these types of cover tasks on some sort of, ranking. And right here, I put one, attention to temporal structure. So it could be that, just attending to perceptual elements of image motion is sort of less attention to temporal structure, whereas if people are attending to the triplets themselves or relationships between them, then that's more attention to temporal structure. And so we wanted to go back to this question about, is statistical learning automatic, with the thought that, with the hypothesis that it may not be so automatic. Maybe the cover task, because the cover task has been treated as sort of equivalent because the process has been thought of as automatic, that maybe if it if the cover task was varied, we could show differences in learning that might suggest that the learning process itself wasn't as automatic as previously believed. So we're going to look at a few attentional manipulations, and I'm going to show you some real data now. So we talked about the jiggle task, and I'm showing you on the y-axis here performance on that 2AFC. When they were asked to attend to jiggles, performance was basically at chance. So the red dot indicates the group mean, and each gray dot indicates a single participant. So we had 120 participants in this particular experiment. Now, what about when participants were explicitly trained? So in this case, they were told, you're going to see triplets. I want you to learn these triplets. And then they were tested by trying to recreate the triplets until they were able to recreate all 4 triplets. And in this case, you see that the group mean is much closer to ceiling, and the distribution is pretty fat, up by 100% of 2AFC correct. Now, what about other cover tasks? Well, we had some pre-existing hypotheses around how cover tasks would be influenced. So I'm going to show you in sort of a rough order of where we thought people's learning would be attenuated. So this one, in this cover task, we asked participants to do a one-back task. So they compared 2 sequential images. And you'll notice that the performance of the group is slightly above where people were with the jiggle task. What about if people were told to just attend to the stimuli? So in this case, it's just a passive cover task. And in this case, again, you see the group mean has risen slightly from the other cover task. What about if you ask participants just to attend to relationships between the stimuli? Again, you see this increase in the mean as assessed by 2AFC. What about a 2-back task? So now you're comparing 2 non-adjacent stimuli. And again, you see an increase in 2AFC performance. And also the final one, what if you just tell them they're going to see triplets and to attend to this triplet structure? And you see a very similar performance on 2AFC. So we have this data here. You can see that there's sort of an increase from left to right across these cover tasks in the 2AFC. But we also tested them with their ability to recreate the triplets afterwards. And you'll see the same pattern of performance in both the 2AFC and this creation task. And this could just be that, in general, the groups do well on both, but what about an individual participant? So what I'm going to show you here is on the y-axis, 2AFC performance, and on the x-axis, how many triplets people created out of 4. And what you can see is people who were at chance with the 2AFC also were about chance with triplets created. So if they created 0, they were towards chance, towards 50%. If they created 4, they were up towards 100%. And we can specify that even more with this little table I'm going to show you, where we broke down 2AFC performance by those participants who couldn't create any triplets and those who could create all 4 triplets. And I'll use the attend to triplets condition as an example, where if they were unable to create any triplets at all, they were at chance. But if they were able to create all 4, then they were near ceiling. And this is the same sort of pattern we observe across all the different conditions. So is statistical learning automatic? Well, we're suggesting that as measured in standard visual statistical learning paradigms, probably not. It likely depends upon attention to temporal structure. And to summarize, it's not that we're arguing that there's no such thing as automatic and implicit regularity detectors. They do exist, and I would point you to Maria Chait's work, for example. And we also understand that humans do gradually extract regularities from their environment. This is something that's been long shown. What we're suggesting is that the paradigms used for measuring visual statistical learning have not necessarily been measuring automatic and implicit learning. And so as next steps, because we're observing that these attentional demands co-vary so strongly with learning, and this is something that's consistent with what's known about associative learning more generally, we ask how, if at all, do the learning processes in these standard VSL paradigms differ from the learning processes in list learning or paired associate tasks? And this is something that's been suggested in a recent review paper where perhaps we need to use new and different paradigms to address this type of question. So I'd like to thank my advisor, Chris Honey, our co-author, Amy Finn, on this work, and help I've received from both the Honey Lab and Janice Chen and her lab. And thank you for your attention.
Great, thank you for that nice talk. So we have a couple of minutes for questions. So it looks like one just came in, and in the interest of time, I'll go ahead and read this out. Okay, we have a few, so y'all can get your votes in, but I'll start with the first one. So this question is from Miriam Ali. The question is, great work. Have you also tried a more implicit memory test? 2 alternative first choice can potentially be done implicitly, but can be contaminated by explicit strategies. Strategies that work best when learning is also explicit. Might a more purish implicit test be more sensitive for automatic or implicit learning? Something like RT facilitation and predictable versus unpredictable triplets.
That's a great question. And it's something I didn't mention in the talk, but yes, we also recorded learning via indirect measures. So we have an RT facilitation task, and in a separate line of research, we show that there are some methodological issues associated with how that's been assessed in the past. So I would say, yes, you can test the implicit memory, but from what we found in this other line, those indirect tasks tend not to show learning.
Great, thank you. So the next question we'll go with is from Gordon Logan. And that question is, how do you define automaticity? Why do you think automatic processing is independent of attention? Isn't learning an inevitable automatic consequence of attending?
It's a good question. Let me think about this. So the thought I had with when I use the terms automatic and implicit, automaticity was the learning process itself. Sort of, if you think about the example we did with the syllables, how you automatically or without effort learned the regularities that you were being exposed to. So it wasn't that you were paying attention to the regularities, even though you were paying attention to the stimuli. And I think that's what I mean by automaticity, versus like the implicit knowledge is more about the resultant knowledge, more about the memory. Hopefully that helps delineate.
Great. So we'll wrap up with one more question, which is a question from Nora Newcomb, and she's asking, are there any implications for studies with infants where no instructions are given?
That's a good question. I don't know how our data applies to infants. I mean, all of our data has been collected with people 18 years and older. We have data that goes up to, I think our oldest participants are over 80. But yeah, it's kind of unclear that infants would be able to deploy any sort of, attention to temporal structure in any sort of like sophisticated way. So I don't know how directly our data applies to the infant statistical learning studies.
Great. Well, thank you, Kevin, and thanks for including an interactive component to your talk. That was delightful. And we'll move on to the next talk and the last talk of this particular session. So we are going to welcome Chris Bates from the University of Rochester up onto the stage now.
Today, I'd like to talk about what efficient data compression can tell us about perceptual memory. This work is in collaboration with my PhD advisor, Robert Jacobs, as well as Chris Sims and Rachel Lurch at Rensselaer Polytechnic. I'd like to first take a step back and look at the computational problem faced by memory systems. So broadly, we can distinguish between the encoding problem and the decoding or retrieval problem. So on the encoding side, we face the problem of how to store information efficiently given a limited storage capacity. And on the decoding or retrieval side, we face the problem of how to recover that information in order to support subsequent decisions or actions. And today, I'm just going to focus on the encoding problem. I'd like to argue that we can gain some insight about the problem of efficient encoding in memory by looking at the problem of video streaming. So we all know that if our internet connection is good, your video call will look something like this, crisp and accurate. But if it's bad, it might look more like this, blurry or impoverished. And so we could put this along a spectrum, and where the clean, crisp pictures are at the high bandwidth end of the spectrum, and they get blurrier or more distorted as you decrease bandwidth, and at some point the image drops out altogether. And so engineers have actually worked pretty hard to try to make this degradation as graceful as possible. But in principle, it could still be better. So for example, in Zoom chats like this, we usually care a lot about faces and less about bodies or backgrounds. And so our bandwidth could be better focused on these parts of the image that are more important to us as the user, while letting other parts be more distorted. So this naturally raises the question of just how much better can we do? And so rate distortion theory formalizes this question. Now, rate distortion theory is a subfield of information theory. And so what rate distortion theory gives us in a nutshell is a theoretical lower bound on distortion. So that would be this optimal lower bound given by the red dashed line. So for any given bandwidth, how far above this red line we are gives us our efficiency. And so we can write down a corresponding design problem. So right now, my computer is trying to send a message to your computer, and we want the received message to have as little distortion as possible. And in order to do that, my computer is converting the image from my camera into a coded message of ones and zeros and sending those across the ether to your computer, which then knows how to decode that message. But these zeros and ones aren't just any zeros and ones. They're actually a specially designed code that's designed to transmit the information as efficiently as possible. So more formally, we're trying to solve this problem, which is to design codes to minimize the average distortion between the sent message X and the received message Y, while not exceeding the capacity limit, or bandwidth in this case. And so I highlighted two key terms in this definition. And so let's look at capacity first. So capacity is measured in bits. And technically speaking, it's the maximum achievable mutual information between X and Y, the sent and received message. And so it's important to point out that bits are actually a measure of information, even though we don't always think of them in that way. But as we saw before, if bandwidth or bit rate is high, then Y, the received image, is crisp and clear, and therefore gives us a lot of information about X, the sent message. So as for mutual information, well, it gets technical, but broadly speaking, it's a measure we can use to tell if we are at peak efficiency given our bandwidth. So for example, let's suppose that we have a bandwidth of 100 megabits per second. We can go and measure our mutual information between X and Y, and that will give us a number in bits. And if that number is less than 100 megabits per second, then we know that we could do better. And so that's capacity, but what about distortion? So we're in a regime here where some amount of distortion is unavoidable because we don't have infinite bandwidth. So which kinds of distortion should we prefer is the question. So should we prefer an image that has less distorted faces, but more distorted backgrounds, or an image that has equal distortion all around? And so our task here is to choose a mathematical expression that best represents the kinds of trade-offs that we want. So that's rate distortion theory in a nutshell, but why am I telling you about this? So it turns out that if you think about it, brains actually face the exact same problem. So our brains have limited bandwidth, and neurons are trying to transmit information to each other. So all we need really to complete this analogy is to replace the zeros and ones that we had before with some sort of neural code, such as spike rates. So under this conception, the neural codes then are these specially designed codes that are trying to transmit information as efficiently as possible. And so if that's true, then we can start to make some predictions about behavior. So in our work, we've distilled rate distortion theory into a set of principles, which we can then test against behavior. But today I'm just going to talk about one corollary to these principles that I find particularly interesting, and that I think may help make sense of some differences between shorter term and longer term memory. And I'm going to call this the categorical bias corollary. So we can apply this corollary in situations where stimuli can be seen as categorical. So for instance, if you're in a task where it's important not to miscategorize the stimulus, then you should encode the stimulus such that you minimize the risk of doing this. And so when you have high capacity, you can encode the stimulus accurately, and therefore there's little risk of miscategorizing, even if you're close to the boundary. So, for example, if your observed stimulus value is here, close to the category boundary, if you have high capacity, well, then your response distribution is going to be peaked, tightly peaked around that true value, and you don't have much risk of miscategorizing. On the other hand, if you have low capacity, your response distribution is going to be much wider, less precise, and therefore you want to introduce a bias that shifts it away from the category boundary, and this keeps the risk of miscategorization low. So this bias here is the categorical bias. So how can we use this theoretical observation? In our work, we've used it to try to understand the relationship between different memory and perceptual subsystems. So for example, it turns out that the literature generally supports an ordering like this along the bias spectrum, where perception has the least bias, categorical bias, and long-term memory has the strongest. But as we've just learned, more bias also implies lower capacity or more compression, assuming that codes are efficient. So therefore, we can hypothesize a spectrum like this, where perception is at the high capacity end, or low sensory distortion, and long-term memory is at the lowest capacity end because it has the highest sensory distortion. Note here that I'm talking about the capacity of a single trace, and not how many traces can be stored concurrently. So by ordering different perceptual and memory systems along this capacity spectrum, we now have a large space from which to generate hypotheses about what drives differences between these systems. So one important problem here is to identify the distortion function or functions that best characterize these systems. So for example, we might ask which kinds of category distinctions are most important to us when encoding a memory. And so we've really only begun to scratch the surface here so far, and we hope that this can be an active area of future research and collaboration. Admittedly, though, the preceding argument was a little bit hand-wavy, as I was trying to extrapolate somewhat wildly from this 1D case, the simple 1D case. So I wanted to see if this correlation, if this principle still holds in high dimensional spaces, like the space of natural images. And so I built a modeling framework to do this. It turns out you can do it, at least approximately, using deep neural networks, which is pretty cool, though I don't have time to go into the details. But to test, to make sure it worked, I simulated human memory for images using a neural network that follows the principles of rate distortion theory. And now note that the neural network is operating on the raw pixel values of the image. And so I trained this model to be able to remember images of various fruit varieties. And I varied the capacity of the model to see whether it followed the categorical bias correlation. So if it does, then we should expect bias to increase as we decrease the capacity of the model, or in other words, as we keep compressing the image further. So in short, this works. Unfortunately, I don't have time to walk you through the details right now, but I think this is really cool because it it suggests that our approach is scalable to natural images. So now I'll just summarize. So I started by asking the question, what does it mean to encode memories efficiently? And I argued that rate distortion theory provides the appropriate conceptual framework for this question. I then presented the categorical bias corollary, which I showed could be useful for understanding the differences between different memory subsystems like long-term and short-term memory. And finally, I showed that these principles of efficiency can be implemented in a model at the level of natural images, suggesting that this framework offers scalability in trying to understand memory systems, which I think is really exciting.
Okay, great. Thank you for that nice talk.
Thank you.
So I think we can give it a minute for questions to roll in from the audience here. Just to answer one question that's come up in the chat, just about whether we're starting the next session late. I think we will start it a few minutes late. We'll push everything back somewhat.
Okay. No takers, huh?
No takers.
That's okay.
Well, thank you so much for a really lovely talk. And for everyone else, thank you for your attention during this session. We are going to push everything back somewhat. So we are going to go ahead and take a 10-minute break. We will start at, we'll start at 3:35, but I do actually want to give the opportunity for Chris to answer this question that just came in. So thanks for this talk. This is a question from Zara Agajan. Do you think this blurring effect happens along the cortical hierarchy in addition to memory?
Does it happen along the cortical? Oh, I think I get the idea. So maybe, I guess the way that I would interpret that question is in terms of some things I've thought about up to this point, which is, you know, if you take this compression hypothesis seriously, then you might ask, well, should I apply it to V1, V2, V4, IT, right? And I think that's, long story short, I don't have an answer for that yet. But I think it's fun to wildly speculate about it. One way to think about it would be that IT would be, you know, a real compression region because it has to do with, you know, these objects that are all the way put together. And then you could think of maybe all the ventral stream leading up to that as sort of the encoder part of the network. But at the same time, you could also think about each distinct module in that ventral stream as being its own sort of memory source, because, you know, maybe we are remembering things in V1 as well, which we can recall later. So yeah, I think there's a lot of questions there.
Mm-hmm. Great. And we have another question that came in that I'll give you the opportunity. This one is from Gordon Logan. So this question is capacity related to precision in visual short-term memory theories?
So it depends on exactly what they mean by precision, but I would say that generally, I don't know if this is what the question asker was getting at, but precision will generally be lower as your capacity shrinks, because your response distribution becomes higher entropy, more noisy, and so and that's true in information channels generally. If you have a noisy information channel, if you decrease the capacity, it's gonna increase the noise of the output, which lowers your precision. Yeah.
Cool. Thank you. And thanks for your patience through the lag there and getting the questions up here. Oh, no and thank you all again for your attention. So we'll resume at 3:35 with session 6, which will be the third session of today. Thanks again, Chris, and to all the speakers of this session.